All right, let's dive into this, huh? Friedrich Nietzsche and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. You know, it's one of those books everyone wants to understand, but it can be a little, well, dense, to put it lightly. Luckily, we've got some great excerpts and some really insightful commentary to guide us.
Oh, yeah. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Definitely not a light read. It's a lot to take in.
The first thing that struck me, honestly, was Zarathustra himself. I mean, he's not just like a puppet for Nietzsche to voice his own ideas, right? The source we're using even calls him like this first tragic philosopher. And get this, they say reading the book should be like listening to music.
I know, right? It definitely throws you for a loop. But I think Nietzsche's doing that on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Right from the beginning, he's signaling that this isn't your typical philosophy book.
Totally.
Comparing Zarathustra to a tragic figure, it just sets this whole mood, a mood of questioning, of struggle. And then the music thing, it's like he's saying, don't come looking for a clear-cut argument here. It's more about the experience.
It's definitely not your average philosophy textbook.
Oh, no, not at all. And I think that's deliberate.
Yeah.
It's like Nietzsche wants us to really wrestle with the text, to grapple with the meaning and not just sit back and absorb information. Yeah, yeah. There's this one line that really stuck with me. It says, yet again, the question of who Zarathustra is, what he stands for, what his purpose is, remains a puzzling question for Zarathustra himself. Zarathustra, in other words, cannot understand what it means to be a spokesman for Zarathustra. It's almost like Zarathustra is a character struggling with who he is, even while he's trying to give us this deep message. Exactly. He's on this journey of self-discovery, figuring himself out as he goes. And that's something we can all relate to, right? I mean, who hasn't felt a little lost, a little unsure about their purpose in life? I think Nietzsche's inviting us to join Zarathustra on his journey. Maybe even find some answers for ourselves along the way.
And that journey, it starts by looking at a pretty bleak reality: nihilism. Nietzsche doesn't beat around the bush about it either. He calls it a collective failure of desire and compares nihilists to, get this, bows that have lost their tension.
Yeah. It's a powerful image, isn't it? Like a bow that just can't shoot an arrow anymore. People who fall into nihilism, they've kind of lost their drive, their sense of purpose.
So how do we avoid becoming those slack bows?
Well, that's where Zarathustra steps in. He's like this wake-up call,
No!
urging us to shake off the nihilism and start striving for something more, for a life that has meaning.
And the way he does it, it's so bold. He uses all this vivid imagery and metaphors, like truth is a woman, the overman's like the sea, tightrope walkers, lions, and children. Honestly, I gotta admit, some of it went right over my head on the first read.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely not an easy read. But I think that's part of the point. Nietzsche believed that, traditional philosophical language, it had just become stale. It wasn't doing the job anymore, not really shaking people up or inspiring them to change the way they live.
So he needed a new kind of language, a way to really bring these radical ideas to life.
Exactly. It's like, think about it. Would you rather read a dry definition of courage in a textbook?
Mm.
Or hear a story about a lion, fearlessly facing down its prey?
I think I'd go for the lion story every time.
Right. Stories, metaphors, these vivid images, that's how Nietzsche gets past our intellectual defenses. He speaks right to our emotions. He wants us to feel these ideas, not just think about them.
Which leads us to one of his most famous and maybe most misunderstood ideas: the Overman.
Oh yeah, the Overman, or the Übermensch, if you want to be fancy and use the original German. A lot of people get this one wrong. They picture some kind of, I don't know, superhero with crazy powers or something.
Yeah, like some kind of Superman.
Right, but it's not about that at all. It's more about an ideal, a way of being that goes beyond the usual ideas of right and wrong and creates new values. It's all about pushing past your limits, about striving for something bigger, something more.
And there's that line, the one where he says, "Behold, I teach you the Overman. He is this sea. In him your great contempt can go under."
Powerful, isn't it? That image of the sea, so vast and boundless, swallowing up even the darkest feelings. It's like a symbol of the Overman's resilience, that inner strength, that ability to keep growing, keep evolving.
So is Nietzsche saying we should all try to become Overmen? Is that even possible?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? He gives us this ideal to aim for, but doesn't really give us a step-by-step guide on how to get there.
So it's more about the journey itself, the constant striving, than reaching some specific destination.
Exactly. And that journey, it starts with facing a really radical idea, the death of God.
Right. And before everyone freaks out, he's not talking about God literally dying. He's talking about the decline of traditional religion and the way it shapes society.
It's like realizing that the old ways of thinking, the old rules about right and wrong, they just aren't working anymore. And that leaves us with a choice.
Yeah. Do we cling to what's familiar even if it's falling apart? Or do we embrace this new freedom, this chance to create our own values and find our own meaning in a world without those old certainties?
It's definitely a scary thought, right? But there's something exciting about it too. This chance to break free from dogma, from being told what to think and believe, and just, define our own lives, create our own meaning.
Like we're standing on the edge of this huge unexplored territory. Scary, yeah, but also kind of exhilarating.
Right. And that's where Nietzsche throws in this mind-blowing concept, eternal recurrence.
Okay, this is where things start to get a little trippy. Eternal recurrence. The idea that everything that happens will just keep repeating itself forever. Every choice, every experience, over and over again for all eternity.
It's like imagine having a button that would make you relive this very day forever. Would you push it?
That's a tough one. I guess it depends on the day.
Exactly. But that's kind of the point of thinking about eternal recurrence. It's not meant to scare us. It's more like a thought experiment that forces us to really consider our choices, to live each moment like it truly matters. Because in a way, it does.
Our source material actually says that eternal recurrence can help us make peace with time itself.
There's this quote, "He will encourage a liberation in which what we took to be what merely happened to us in the past can be assumed as a burden of one's own doing, that one will heroically take on what merely was as one's own, and so transform it into, thus I willed it." It's about taking ownership of our past, recognizing that all those moments, even the ones we wish hadn't happened, they all helped make us who we are.
Instead of being stuck in the past, we can choose to see it as something we actively created, even the difficult parts.
Exactly. And when you change your perspective like that, it can be really empowering. It frees us from feeling like a victim of circumstance and lets us step into our power as creators of our own lives.
So it's like we become the authors of our own stories instead of just characters being pushed around by fate.
Right. And that's where the idea of the will to power comes
Yeah,
in.
okay, let's talk about that. The will to power is another one of those Nietzschean ideas that often gets twisted around, doesn't it? People think it means like this ruthless desire to control everyone and everything.
Yeah, it gets a bad rap. But Nietzsche saw it as something a lot deeper and more, well, multifaceted. To him, it's the driving force in all living things. It's about growing, expressing yourself, mastering your surroundings.
So it's less about dominating others and more about mastering yourself.
Exactly. Think about, like, the force that makes a seed sprout or a flower bloom or even a bird building its nest. It's that inherent drive to expand, to break free from limits, and to create something new.
And that drive can express itself in so many different ways, right? Not just through like aggression or competition.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the will to power that goes into creating art
Mhm.
or solving a complex problem or even just learning something new. It's that inner fire that pushes us to grow, to learn, to create, to make our mark on the world.
And you can definitely see that drive at work in the way Zarathustra talks about love and friendship. He's got some pretty unconventional views on those topics.
He does. And they're often misunderstood, kind of like the whole will to power thing.
Like that line where he says, "Woman is not yet capable of friendship." I bet that raised a few eyebrows, even back then.
Oh, I'm sure it did. But it's important to keep the historical context in mind. Nietzsche was writing in the late 1800s, a time when women were basically confined to the home and didn't have the same opportunities as men.
So maybe he was critiquing the social restrictions on women rather than saying they weren't capable of friendship.
I think that's a much fairer interpretation, yeah. He was always pushing back against social norms, questioning everything, including the expectations around gender roles.
And when you look at what he says about friendship in general, he sets the bar pretty high for both men and women. He talks about friendship as this crucible, a real test of character.
Right. True friendship, for Zarathustra, it means being honest, being vulnerable, being willing to challenge each other to grow. It's not about blind loyalty or pretending everything's perfect. It's about pushing each other to become better.
He's got this really interesting line about how the friend should be a master of guessing and keeping silent. You must not want to see everything. Your dream should reveal to you what your friend does while waking.
It's almost like he's saying, a true friend respects your space. They trust you to figure things out on your own. They don't need to know every single detail of your life to be your friend.
It's about trusting each other's individuality, letting each other become who they're meant to be.
Exactly. And that ties in really well with his emphasis on self-overcoming, which is like this central theme running through Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Oh yeah, self-overcoming, that's really at the heart of it all for Nietzsche. He sees life as this constant struggle to overcome our weaknesses, face our fears, and just become more than we are right now.
And he uses the image of the inner beast to represent those darker parts of ourselves, the parts we often try to hide.
Right, that inner beast is like our primal instincts, our shadow side, the things we don't want to admit are there.
So the goal isn't to get rid of those parts of ourselves.
No, it's more about acknowledging them,
Yeah.
facing them head on, and then integrating them into who we are. It's by facing those shadows and pushing past our limitations that we can really achieve self-mastery and get closer to that ideal of the overman.
It's like shedding old skin, right? Breaking free from the chains that have been holding us back.
Exactly. And it's through this process of self-overcoming that we can really tap into our full potential and create a life that's truly our own.
Okay, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already. Zarathustra wrestling with his own identity, the challenge of nihilism, the idea of the overmen, the death of God, the mind-bending eternal recurrence, the will to power, and the importance of self-overcoming.
I know, right? And we've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack, so many more layers to this book. It's amazing.
Yeah, this is just the beginning. There's a whole lot more to explore.
One of the things that really strikes me about Thus Spoke Zarathustra is how Nietzsche manages to like weave these big philosophical ideas together with these really personal reflections on, love, solitude, finding meaning, all that.
Yeah, it's true. It's not just this like heady intellectual thing. You really feel like you're getting a glimpse into Nietzsche's own struggles, his own triumphs.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why Thus Spoke Zarathustra has like resonated with so many people for so long. It speaks to this deep human desire for a life that matters,
Yeah.
this urge to like push past our limitations and become something more.
Speaking of pushing past limitations, one of the most powerful images in the book has got to be that rope over an abyss metaphor, right?
Oh, absolutely. That one's from the section called On the Three Metamorphoses, where Nietzsche lays out these three stages of kind of spiritual development.
Yeah.
The camel, the lion, and the child.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts too. I mean, it's such a vivid image, and it really captures that feeling of how precarious our existence is. We're all like that rope stretched between our animal nature and our potential to transcend it all. And
Yeah.
just below us, there's this gaping abyss of nihilism.
Totally. It's like walking a tightrope, right? With incredibly high stakes, like one wrong step and
Yeah, it's intense, but it's not just a dark image. It's also like this call to action, a challenge to become something more. So break it down for us. The camel, what's that all about?
the camel, that's the burden bearer, right? The one who accepts all the weight of tradition, of conventional morality, like carrying all that baggage of the past around on its back.
So all the expectations, the shoulds and shouldn'ts, all that stuff.
Exactly. That's that first stage, where we're all weighed down by what everyone else expects of us.
But the camel can't stay a camel forever.
Nope, definitely not. Eventually, the camel's got to transform into the lion.
The lion. Okay, so what does the lion represent?
The lion, that's the rebel, the one who questions everything, challenges those old traditions, and breaks free from all those expectations. It's about finding your own roar,
So saying enough is enough, I'm not going to be defined by all these rules.
Exactly. It's that moment when you say, I'm creating my own path.
Powerful
Yeah.
stuff. But the lion isn't the final stage, is it?
Nope, not quite. The lion's crucial for breaking free, but it's not enough to just, like, tear everything down. To really become the overman, to build something new, the lion has to transform one more time.
And that's where the child comes in. It's funny, when I think of the overman, all that strength and self-mastery, a child isn't the first image that pops into my head.
Right. You think of innocence, playfulness, all that. But that's what makes it such a brilliant metaphor. Think about what it means to be a child, You're free from the past, open to anything, full of wonder and curiosity.
It's like that, what do they call it, beginner's mind, that Zen Buddhist idea. You're not limited by all those preconceived notions. You're open to experiencing everything with fresh eyes.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what Nietzsche's getting at with this child, is the final stage of the overman. It's about finding that wonder again, that joy in creation, that ability to look at the world like it's brand new.
It's about becoming an artist, approaching life with that playful, experimental energy.
Right. The child, it's like the culmination of that whole journey, the embodiment of the overman who's dancing to the music of their own will.
And speaking of dancing, Nietzsche uses that metaphor a lot to describe the overman's freedom, that creative spirit, like that line where he says, "Even in happiness there are heavy creatures, there are born ponderipeds, quaintly they struggle, like an elephant struggling to stand on its head. But it is better to be foolish with happiness than foolish with unhappiness. Better to dance ponderously than to walk lamely."
Love that one. He's saying embrace life, find the
Yeah.
joy in becoming, even if it's messy, even if it's awkward.
Don't be afraid to look a little silly, right? It's better to dance badly than not dance at all.
Exactly. And I think that's so important, especially in a world that's like obsessed with perfection and fitting in. Nietzsche's like, hey, embrace your imperfections, dance to your own beat.
Okay, so how does all this tie into his views on morality? We touched on this a little earlier, but it's a big part of his philosophy.
Yeah. Huge. And it's where he really shakes things up. Nietzsche was a harsh critic of traditional morality, especially the Christian kind. He saw it as life-denying, based on resentment.
Like it was holding people back from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. He felt like he created this system of values that prized weakness and conformity instead of strength and individuality.
And then there's that famous line where he calls for a revaluation of all values. What did he mean by that? Was he like advocating for a world without any morals?
No, no, not at all. He wasn't against morality, just a certain kind of morality,
Mm.
the kind that he saw as restrictive and suffocating. He thought we needed to create a new morality, one that celebrated life and human potential.
Okay, so what would this new morality be based on?
Well, that's where his idea of the will to power comes back in. He believed that our moral system should be rooted in that drive to grow and express yourself.
So instead of saying an action is good or bad just because, we should be asking whether it, like, helps or hurts that will to power, whether it contributes to our growth as individuals.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from just blindly following rules to cultivating inner strength and being true to yourself.
It's like asking, does this make me stronger, more alive, more me? Or does it weaken me, make me shrink down, force me to fit someone else's mold?
Exactly. It's a totally different way of looking at things. And it takes a lot of introspection, a lot of honesty with yourself. But ultimately, I think it's a much more empowering way to approach morality.
And it definitely fits with that whole idea of self-overcoming, that journey toward the overman.
Absolutely. For Nietzsche, morality isn't about just following a bunch of preset rules. It's about always challenging yourself, pushing your own boundaries, and becoming the best version of yourself.
It's about figuring out your own values, the ones that really resonate with who you are, and then living a life that reflects those values.
Exactly. And that's what makes Thus Spoke Zarathustra such a challenging but rewarding read.
Mm.
It doesn't give you all the answers, but it makes you ask the tough questions. It makes you think.
And it does it all so beautifully. The language is so rich, the image is so vivid. It really stays with you.
I know, right? And that's one of the things that makes it such a great book for, discussion and interpretation. It's almost like Nietzsche's inviting us to become co-creators of the meaning, to find our own understanding of his work.
It's one of those books that you can read on so many different levels, and each time you come back to it, you find something new.
Totally. He's not trying to hand down some rigid doctrine. He's offering us a starting point for this journey of self-discovery. And like any good journey, it can be both exhilarating and scary.
Well, speaking of journeys, we've covered a lot of ground here. That whole metaphor of the rope over the abyss, the three metamorphoses, the importance of dance and playfulness, Nietzsche's ideas about morality, that revaluation of values. It's a lot to unpack.
And there's still so much more to dig into. Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a gold mine. One thing that's really stayed with me throughout all these discussions about Thus Spoke Zarathustra is how Nietzsche doesn't shy away from exploring the really personal, even kind of vulnerable parts of being human. It's not all just big abstract concepts and stuff.
I know what you mean. He gets really real about the challenges, the joys, all of it. It's what makes it feel so relatable, even if the ideas themselves are pretty complex.
Exactly. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's like you get this sense of Nietzsche's own struggles, his own triumphs. It makes the ideas hit home a lot harder.
It does. Like there's that section, the Song of Melancholy, where he's wrestling with this burden of searching for truth. There's that line, I think it goes, "Thus I myself once sank for my own truth madness, From my longings of the day, weary of the day, sick from light, sink downward, eveningward, shadowward, by one truth burned and thirsty. It's like he's describing a kind of spiritual exhaustion, like all that intense questioning can really take a toll.
It's so powerful. He's not pretending it's easy, this whole pursuit of truth thing.
Mm.
It can be hard, it can be uncomfortable, there can be a real price to pay.
Right. And I think there's a certain loneliness that runs through a lot of less spoke Zarathustra. I mean, Zarathustra spends a lot of his time like alone up in the mountains just thinking about these huge questions.
Yeah. Solitude, it's crucial for Zarathustra. Like, that's where he has his biggest breakthroughs, you know. That's where he confronts all his inner demons and finds his strength again. But he's honest about it. He doesn't try to make it sound like it's always, rainbows and butterflies.
He doesn't romanticize it.
No. He admits it can be painful, it can be isolating. There's even a part where he says, I go now to my solitude, so I may once again have light and sun. It's like he needs to be alone for a while, to recharge, to find his way back to himself before he can go back out and share his wisdom.
So he's not saying we all need to become hermits,
That's right.
right? It's more about finding that balance between being alone and being connected.
Yeah, exactly. We need both. Time by ourselves to, like, think, recharge, just be with our own thoughts. But we also need connection, community, those relationships to really thrive.
It's interesting, though, even when he's alone, Zarathustra isn't really alone, right? He's got these encounters with all these strange characters, the fire dog, the ugliest man, not your typical philosophical conversation partners.
Definitely not. But they each represent something. They each shed light on, like, what it means to be human and the difficulties of trying to live a life that matters.
Yeah, that fire dog with his cynical kind of world-weary attitude.
Yeah, it's like he represents this skeptical voice, that voice that's always questioning, always doubting.
And then there's the ugliest man who's all about pity and resentment.
Exactly. Nietzsche saw those things, pity and resentment, as really destructive forces. Like, they can weaken our will and prevent us from fully embracing life.
And Zarathustra doesn't just avoid these figures. He actively engages with them, even when their ideas are tough to hear.
Right. He wrestles with them, challenges them, and ultimately rejects their kind of nihilistic worldview. He doesn't let them drag him down into despair or cynicism, even when things are tough, when there's suffering and ugliness in the world.
And that speaks to his deep belief that something better is possible, that striving for the overman is worth it, even when it seems like there's no hope.
Exactly. He doesn't pretend it's easy, but he points us toward a different way of living, a way of being in the world that embraces all of it, the good and the bad, and finds meaning even in the midst of suffering.
And then at the very end, he leaves us with this image, the nuptial ring of rings, the ring of recurrence. Talk about a loaded metaphor.
I know, right? It's one of the most mysterious and debated parts of the whole book.
Yeah.
But I think it circles back to the idea of eternal recurrence. Like, the ring, with its circular shape, it represents that eternal cycle, of life and death and rebirth.
And the fact that it's a nuptial ring, it hints at some kind of union, a coming together of opposites.
Right, like maybe the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, or even the human and the divine.
So if we take this idea of the ring of recurrence seriously, how does it change the way we live our lives?
Well, if you really believe that every moment is going to repeat itself forever, then every choice you make, every action, it takes on a whole new level of importance, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a fleeting moment anymore. It's part of this eternal pattern, this cosmic dance.
It's a challenge to live a life so full, so meaningful, so true to yourself that you'd be okay with living it over and over again forever.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It's a call to really live consciously, to make choices you can stand behind, not just in this moment, but for all time.
It's both intimidating and inspiring at the same time.
It is. Just like Nietzsche's work. It challenges us, makes us think, and ultimately, I think, helps us live more authentically, more fully.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We've covered a lot of ground, unpacked a lot of metaphors, wrestled with some pretty big ideas. But like any great philosophical work, this is just the beginning, really.
It's an ongoing process, this reflection, interpretation, self-discovery. And that's what Nietzsche wanted, I think. He didn't want to just give us the answers, He wanted us to get curious, to use our imaginations, to find our own way to a more meaningful life.
He wanted us to become philosophers ourselves.
Yes, to question everything, to embrace the uncertainty, and to never stop reaching for something more.
I love that. Well, on that note, here's something to think about. If you really believed in this idea of eternal recurrence, if you knew you were going to live your life over and over again, how would it change the way you live today? What choices would you make differently? What values would you really focus on?
It's definitely a question worth asking, and I hope you'll keep exploring Thus Spoke Zarathustra, keep wrestling with those ideas. You never know what you might discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, keep becoming.